When writing any type of program for a client, it is important that it is based on solid scientific training principles. It must also match the client's goals and their level of motivation and commitment. Let's face it, the effectiveness of your strength training program lies in the client's ability to actually do it. The best strength program in the entire world is rendered completely ineffective if the client doesn't enjoy it and thus doesn't do it. So when designing strength programs, there are some main factors that need to be considered that will determine the physiological response. These are the frequency of training, the intensity of training, the volume of training, and the type of resistance training. Hopefully you will recognize these similarities to the FIT principle. Your job as an instructor is to manipulate these variables in order to tailor the program to your client. Now remember, in order to keep your clients safe, it is important to progressively overload them. So when deciding what variables to manipulate, you must keep it in balance. For example, if you decide to increase the intensity of their training, then the volume of their training would need to be reduced. Or if the frequency of their training is decreased, then the intensity or the volume would need to increase. When prescribing a strength program for beginners, we can follow the guidelines of the American Council of Sports Medicine, which recommends that strength training be performed twice a week, with the session consisting of 2 to 3 sets of about 8 to 10 exercises for 8 to 10 repetitions per exercise. Now this is a great starting point, but clearly you have the ability to change the variables to make it more specific to your client's needs. Before writing a program, it is also important to take into consideration the client's individual differences. Things such as genetics, lifestyle, and training experience will all influence how you write a program. For example, one of the major red lights or barriers to training is that many people are time poor. So some people may only be able to commit to 2 to 3 training sessions per week, which means you would need to be able to write an effective program that caters to that. Some people have a personal preference of training at higher intensities, whereas others prefer lower intensities. Some may need longer to recover, whilst others recover really quickly. No matter what it is, you just need to be aware of the individual differences and prescribe accordingly. When trying to figure out the frequency of someone's training, you must firstly understand how long it's going to take to recover. In general, if there is a high volume and a high intensity, then the recovery time is going to be anywhere from 72 up to 120 hours, which means that they could only be able to do 2 of these types of sessions every 7 to 8 days. However, if the session is low in both volume and intensity, then the recovery time is going to be quicker, at around 24 to 48 hours, which means the overall frequency of this training can be 3 times per week. It makes sense that the harder one trains, the more recovery one needs. How hard the training session is going to be dependent on a couple of things, like the intensity and the volume. In strength training, the intensity is defined as the amount of exertion, which is normally expressed as the number of repetitions performed at a certain weight. We normally refer to the weight as being a percentage of a 1 RM, which means a percentage of their real maximal effort. Whilst actually determining a client's 1 RM is possible, it is only used by experienced PTs with advanced clients. In order for you to determine a working percentage, there are many tables that can help you guesstimate how many repetitions would equate with a certain percentage of a 1 RM. For example, we can assume that between 8 to 12 repetitions would roughly equate to about 80 to 70% of a 1 RM. At this particular rep range and at this intensity, the client is likely to get benefits in both strength and hypertrophy and some muscular endurance. If the client's goals were pure strength or pure hypertrophy or pure muscular endurance, then we would manipulate the rep range and thus the intensity to get the desired training effect for the different goal. The number of sets and the overall amount of work being done in a session makes reference to the volume of a session. As was mentioned prior, just how many sets and repetitions are completed is dependent on the overall goal of the session. Typically, multiple sets are often used with most training goals. If the goal is strength focused, and we know that the rep range is low, around 4 to 8 reps, then it is normal to do many sets, for example 3 to 5 working sets. And we call them working sets because it excludes the warm-up sets. This is then going to require a good amount of rest time between the sets to allow for recovery before the next set is started. In a strength protocol, and for all intermediate or advanced clients, 3 to 5 minutes rest between the sets is the norm, and this is to allow nervous system recovery. The amount of sets and the amount of rest between sets will tend to be less when training for hypertrophy or for muscular endurance. The reason the rest periods tend to be less for hypertrophy and for muscular endurance is because the loads tend to be lighter. The rest periods aren't just about allowing for neural recovery. They are also used to manipulate energy systems and the hormones. For example, when wanting to improve one's anaerobic fitness through the use of weights, it can be done by having minimal rest periods. This creates an environment where the metabolic byproduct of lactic acid is produced, and by not allowing a full recovery, the body has to tolerate working at intensity with the presence of lactate in the system. This helps to improve the overall anaerobic fitness of the individual. Similarly, if one is doing hypertrophy training, having rest periods of only 60 to 90 seconds ensures that the optimal amount of the anabolic hormones, growth hormone and testosterone, are released, and they influence the overall hypertrophy effect. Bear in mind that when working with beginner clients, their rest periods, regardless of their end goal, will be around 60 to 90 seconds because this will ensure the optimal amount of energy, system and neural recovery and the optimal hormonal response for a person of that level. Another variable that can be manipulated that will affect the overall volume of a session is the tempo, or the speed in which a repetition is performed. Normally when teaching a beginner, we prescribe a 2-2 count, which means it takes 2 seconds to perform the eccentric part of the move and 2 seconds to perform the concentric part of the move. A 2-2 tempo is normally used as it is a good speed for teaching control and form to a beginner client. As a client progresses, the tempo can also be manipulated, meaning that more time under tension is created in the muscle, which ultimately affects the end result. The tempo is always expressed as a ratio number, with the first number representing the eccentric component and the second number being the concentric phase. Obviously, if there is more time under tension on the muscle, then that is harder for the working muscle groups to control and requires more effort on their behalf. Let's take a squat for example. The outcome I get from prescribing 10 reps at a 1-1 tempo is very different than if I prescribe 10 reps at a 3-3 tempo. On a 1-1 tempo, the set would be over in 20 seconds, whereas on the 3-3 tempo, the set would take 60 seconds, 3 times longer. This means more work for the muscles, which means more stimulus for those muscles. Okay, that's a lot to take on board. So let's recap everything that has been discussed. When designing effective programs, remember you want to take into consideration the client's goal and then determine how to manipulate the appropriate training variables, the frequency of their training, the intensity of their training, the volume of their training, and the type of their training.